the 4 pillars of modern decision making. This is going to be the first formalization that we do to attempt to figure out what is a good decision. Decisions essentially always follow the same pattern if you want to do it in the proper way. You first always have to, let's say, map the different outcomes that could happen, right? You have to make a decision, a business decision, a private decision, life decision. You have to picture to see what is going to be the outcome that is going to happen because you go left or go right. And you have, although you do it like very implicitly and not many people think about it, let's say in practical terms, you essentially have to set priors on these different outcomes. What if I take that way? What if I go that path, down that road? What is going to be the probability that I get a positive or a negative outcome? This is the different priors that we're going to set to different outcomes. And then we finally make a decision. We see these different outcomes. We see the different priors that we have in terms of value that we are going to get from this outcome. And then we take a step. We just move forward and commit to that decision. We go down that road. And once we have done that, we should be observing a reward. That is the cycle, the decision-making cycle. Outcome, prior setting, actions, and reward. And if we manage to successfully close the loop here, we essentially can figure out whether we made a good or a bad decision. Because if the reward that we took associated with the outcome that happened for the priors that we set based on the action that we took, if that is positive, if that is EV positive, the value that you generated was actually positive, well, you can essentially kind of like think about it like a good decision. The actual path that you took was a good decision. But that brings us to the fundamental problem of decision making. The fundamental problem is what is called the counterfactual. The counterfactual is essentially the theoretical other path that you could have taken and the theoretical other value that you could have generated if you had taken that path. It's essentially what is highlighted in many movies, from Mr. Nobody to The Butterfly Effect, to any movie that attempts to show you what would have happened if you had followed another route, if you had followed another direction. The counterfactual is precisely what tells you what would have happened if you had done something different. What if you had done something different, what if you had generated a bad outcome? Well, then it reinforces you in your belief that taking the first route, taking outcome number one, let's say path number one, was the actually right choice here because it was positive in value, and taking the route number two was the wrong choice here because the value was negative. That is pretty simple. But what if both values would have been positive, but one would have been more positive than the other? Then the counterfactual is essentially what you need to be able to know the incremental value, the incremental effect of taking route number one versus route number two. If you do not have the counterfactual, you know that you made a good decision, you know that you got value from decision number one, path number one, but you don't know how good that decision is because you cannot quantify it, you cannot see the difference between what would have happened between number one and number two. The counterfactual is essentially what it's the holy grail, is what you always attempt to quantify when you do, for instance, an experiment. When you do an experiment and you want to study, for instance, whether providing something to the population increase their happiness or their welfare, you essentially create an experiment where you give something to a sample of the population and you don't give something to another sample of the population. And you observe the average reward of the two groups, assuming that, let's say, the two groups are homogeneous. You conduct randomized trial surveys, studies, to be able to compute the incremental value of a policy from the actuals to the counterfactuals. Well, this is exactly what's happening here. To be able to make a decision, we always need to be able to compute the counterfactual, and that is the only way to properly close the cycle of decision making here. Now, I'm making the statement that you need all 4 artifacts to be able to have a good decisions. So what does decision making without all of these artifacts actually look like? Well, let's look first of all at, let's say, the first triad, the triad where you have an outcome mapping, an action taking, and a prior setting. What you do not have in your decision making system is a reward. You are not observing what is the value that you get from taking an action based on the outcome that you could see. And essentially, when you don't have a reward generation, when you do not know what is the value associated with the action that you took, you don't have any learning. You cannot figure out if you did something correctly. And that is what I call an improper decision system or an incomplete decision system. It's the same story if you do not do previous mapping of the outcomes. If you pick one potential route that you can take, take your action and generate a reward. What happens when you do not have the outcome mapping is you do not have experimentation. This is exactly what I highlighted before. You do not have a system that tells you how well you have done compared to another route that you could have taken. You do not have your counterfactuals, and so you do not have the incremental value of your decision based on the different paths that could have been taken. Then the third system is the lack of priors here. To understand the lack of priors, we need to understand what focus is. The world is essentially a massive exploration space, right? When we think about making decisions, we think about learning, we think about, let's say, developing things in the world. We essentially search for value in a massive search space. We could do anything we want. So we need some focus. We need to figure out through a scientific method, through a rational thinking method, we need to figure out where should we spend our focus, right? There is many outcomes, many directions, many actions we could take. If we do not have the prior mapping, well, we essentially are mapping a couple or a few outcomes out of a universe of different outcomes that could happen. And if we do that, if we do not set our priors, we never know whether we're taking some actions, we're trying to make decisions in a suboptimal space, in some kind of like local optima, where we're exploring a part of the universe, but we do not explore, let's say, the vast sea of the universe where we could make some decisions and generate some good reward. We do not have some focus here if we do not set our priors. And then finally, a more intuitive one. Well, if you have your outcome mapping, you have the reward that is associated with each outcome, and you have set your priors so that you are in a decent search space in terms of like where you're making decisions. But you do not have actions here. You do not take any actions. You just, go with the status quo. You never change anything. How do I know that another direction that doesn't have this steady stream of positive values, steady streams of reward, could potentially have higher reward? I don't know it because I've never tried any other action, so I've never generated any other reward, right? The lack of action is a lack of challenging of the status quo, and it's by definition the impossibility, therefore, of knowing, let's say, axiomatically that the outcome and the reward that we're generating are optimal, because we do not know if other actions would lead to other set of value.